I should have told him no. It would have been so easy. Just one word. Just one simple step back. But I didn't. And that's how it all started. Before we get into the details, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from. When my son Sam packed his bags for a 2-week trip to the lake with his friends, I felt something close to relief. Not because I wanted him gone, I loved my son more than anything, but because I needed space. Time to think. Time to breathe. And maybe time to figure out when my marriage had finally collapsed in on itself. Because the truth was, it had. Ben and I had been married for 22 years. It was a quiet kind of marriage now, hollow in all the places that used to feel full. I used to look forward to him coming home, but now I counted down the hours until I could turn off the bedroom light and pretend to sleep just to avoid the heavy silence between us. He stopped noticing me, and at some point I stopped trying to be noticed. So when I pulled into the driveway after dropping Sam off, the house felt different. Lighter. Quieter. Like something was about to shift. I just didn't know how much. Nate showed up that afternoon. My son's best friend. I'd known him since he was a lanky 12-year-old, always trailing a few steps behind Sam, always cracking jokes, always so full of life. But the boy I used to know wasn't the one standing on my porch, leaning on crutches, his foot wrapped in a thick brace. He was older now. Taller. Stronger. More confident. And when he looked at me, really looked at me, something inside me tightened in a way I didn't want to name. "Mrs. Callahan," he grinned, shifting his weight to one side. "Mind if I crash here for a bit?" Twisted my ankle cliff jumping. The guys went ahead without me, and I figured Sam wouldn't mind if I hung around.
His voice was the same. Warm. Familiar.
But the way his eyes lingered, just a beat too long, was new. "Of course," I said automatically, stepping aside. "You know you're always welcome here." That was my first mistake. He settled in easily. Too easily. By the second day, he was making himself at home, walking around shirtless despite his injury, raiding the fridge like it was his own. He filled the silence of the house with easy laughter, teasing me about my terrible taste in reality TV, telling me stories about college, about girls, about all the things I had no business listening to but couldn't pull myself away from. He made me feel alive again. And that was my second mistake. Then came the night I stopped pretending. It was hot. A thick, suffocating heat that settled in my chest and refused to let go. I stood in the kitchen, fanning myself as I poured a glass of wine, when I heard his voice behind me. "You always look this good when no one's watching?" I turned. Nate stood in the doorway, barefoot, shirtless, his gaze slow and deliberate as it traced over me in a way that sent a sharp, electric pulse straight through my core. "Nate, tell me I'm imagining this," he said quietly, stepping closer. "Tell me it's all in my head, and I'll stop." I should have. I didn't. And that was my biggest mistake of all. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. Just a moment. A mistake. A fleeting thrill that meant nothing. Except it wasn't. Because Nate didn't let it be. He lingered. Always in my space. Always watching me like he was waiting for me to crack. He'd brush his hand against mine when I passed him the coffee, sit too close on the couch, say things that made my breath hitch in my throat. And I let him. I let him ruin me. Ben was supposed to come home that Friday. I spent the whole day telling myself that once he was back, this would stop. That I'd forget the way Nate's fingers had traced lazy patterns against my wrist. That I'd forget the way his voice dipped when he spoke to me in that way that made my stomach tighten. But Ben never came home. Last-minute meeting. Another business trip. Another excuse. And that night, as I sat on the back porch with a second glass of wine, Nate stepped outside, looked at me, and smiled. "You knew he wasn't coming back, didn't you?" he murmured, sinking into the chair beside me. I swallowed hard. "Go to bed, Nate." He leaned in, his lips barely brushing my ear. "Say the word, and I will." I said nothing.
And that was the beginning of the end.
I should have known it wouldn't stay a secret. Secrets like this never do. It started small. A text from Ben. A question about who had been in the house while he was gone. Then another. And another. Until the night I found him standing in the hallway, Nate's hoodie in his hands, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly.
Whose is this?
I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Because he knew. And I knew he knew. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. You think I haven't noticed? Ben's voice was quiet. Almost too quiet. The way you look at him. The way he looks at you.
Ben.
He let out a bitter laugh. I should have seen this coming. God, I was so stupid. I reached for him, but he pulled back. Don't. His jaw clenched. Just tell me one thing. Was it worth it? I wanted to say no, but we both knew that would be a lie. Ben left that night, packed a bag, walked out the door. He didn't slam it,
Didn't yell.
didn't break anything. But the way he looked at me before he turned away was worse than all of that. Because it was final. And I knew, in that moment, that I had lost him. But I wasn't done losing things. Because 2 days later, Sam came home. And the second he saw Nate, the second he saw the shift in me, he knew. And when he walked past me without a word, when he looked at me with something so close to disgust it made my stomach churn, I realized I had lost him too. And suddenly, I wasn't sure if I had won anything at all. The silence was unbearable. Sam barely looked at me. I tried to act normal, pretending the weight of my choices wasn't pressing down on me with every passing second. But there was no normal anymore. Not when my son, the person I had spent my entire life loving, protecting, couldn't even stand to be in the same room as me. Nate knew it too. He wasn't the same either. The cocky smirks, the teasing glances, gone. He barely spoke, and when he did, it wasn't to me. And then on the third day, he left. No warning.
No idea.
Just a note on the kitchen counter. I never meant to ruin anything. That was it. And just like that, he was gone too. The fallout came quickly. Ben wasn't subtle about the divorce. He wanted it done fast, wanted to be rid of me before the ink had time to dry on the papers. And I didn't fight him. How could I? I had no defense, no excuses. No one was on my side. My friends whispered behind my back. My neighbors gave me looks filled with judgment. But none of it compared to Sam. Sam, who moved in with his father before I could even beg him to stay. Sam, who refused to answer my calls, my texts, my desperate attempts to explain. And maybe that was the worst part. There was no explanation. No good reason. No way to make any of it okay. I had broken my own life into pieces. And I was the only one left to pick them up. Months passed. I learned how to be alone. I stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes, hoping Sam would call. I stopped expecting to see Nate's car in the driveway. I stopped waiting for Ben to change his mind. Because none of them were coming back. And I had no one to blame but myself. So I did the only thing I could. I moved on. Then, almost a year later, I got a message from an unknown number. You should know Nate's back in town. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't heard his name in months, hadn't let myself think about him. And yet, with just those few words, everything I had spent so long trying to bury came rushing back. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to run from him, or straight to him. I didn't reply to the message. I should have deleted it. Pretended I never saw it. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Nate was back. And I had no idea what that meant. That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned, my mind running in circles. Would he try to see me? Did he even want to? Or was he just passing through, a ghost from my past reminding me of everything I had lost? By morning, I had convinced myself it didn't matter. I wouldn't seek him out. I wouldn't let myself fall back into the mess I had barely crawled out of. But deep down, I knew better. Because some things never really leave you.
And Nate was one of them.
I saw him 3 days later. I was leaving the grocery store, arms full of bags, when I heard someone call my name. A voice I knew too well. a voice I had spent months trying to forget. I turned, and there he was, standing by his car, hands shoved into his pockets, watching me with that same quiet intensity that had once unraveled my entire life. He looked different, older, sharper, and yet exactly the same. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then slowly he smiled. "Hey, Mrs. Callahan." His voice sent a chill down my spine. I swallowed hard, gripping the plastic bags in my hands like they could somehow keep me grounded. "Nate." His smile faltered just slightly. "Didn't think I'd see you so soon." I forced a laugh. "Small town." He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. And suddenly, I realized I couldn't do this. I couldn't stand here, pretending the past didn't exist, pretending my heart wasn't slamming against my ribs like it wanted to escape. I took a step back. "It was good seeing you," I murmured. And before he could say another word, I turned and walked away. But of course, it wasn't over. Because 2 nights later, he showed up at my door. I froze the second I saw him standing on my porch. It was late, too late for this to be a coincidence. But he wasn't smiling this time. He wasn't teasing. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening around the doorknob. "I don't think that's a good idea, Nate," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Please." That one word shattered my defenses. I stepped aside and let him in. The silence between us stretched as we stood in my living room, neither of us knowing where to start. Finally, he spoke. "I never meant to leave like that." I flinched. "You didn't really have a choice, did you?" He frowned. "I could have stayed. I should have stayed." "Why?" My voice cracked. "What would that have changed?" He exhaled sharply. "Everything." For a long moment, we just stared at each other. And then, finally, I said what I had been too afraid to admit for an entire year. "It doesn't matter anymore, Nate." He took a step closer. "It does to me." His voice was quiet. And suddenly, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't over. It had never been over. And I didn't know if I was strong enough to walk away again. I should have told him to leave. But I didn't. Because deep down I knew the truth. I had never really let him go. Nate watched me, waiting. Waiting for me to tell him to walk out that door and disappear again. Waiting for me to stop him. And I hated him for it. Because he knew. He knew I was too weak to turn him away. "You have no idea what my life became after you left," I whispered, my voice shaking. His jaw clenched. "I can imagine." "No," I snapped, my chest tightening. "You can't. You didn't have to watch your son look at you like you were a stranger. You didn't have to sign divorce papers alone. You didn't have to pick up the broken pieces of." I stopped myself. I was shaking now, my breath coming too fast. "And Nate?" He looked wrecked. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said hoarsely. I let out a bitter laugh. "Well, congratulations. You did anyway." The room felt too small. The air too thick. I needed him to leave. I needed him to stay. And then, before I could decide, he whispered something I wasn't ready for. "I never stopped thinking about you." The words hit like a hammer to my chest. I closed my eyes, willing myself to stay in control. "You can't say that," I murmured. "Why?" "Because it doesn't change anything." Nate exhaled, his shoulders tense. "Doesn't it?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Because I didn't have an answer. And he knew it. He stayed that night. Not because I asked him to. Not because it was the right thing to do. But because I couldn't bear the thought of watching him leave again. And maybe, just maybe, he couldn't bear the thought of leaving. Morning came too fast. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. A text from Sam. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard from him in months. I hesitated before opening it. But nothing could have prepared me for what it said. "We need to talk. Now." I barely had time to process it before there was a knock at the door. A hard, urgent knock. My breath caught. Not Sam.
Ben.
I froze. For a second I thought I had imagined it, that if I stayed still long enough, the knock would disappear, and I wouldn't have to face whatever waited for me on the other side of that door. But then it came again. Louder, sharper. A demand. Nate shifted beside me. He was already awake, sitting on the edge of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees. He didn't have to ask who it was. We both knew.
Ben.
I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. My legs felt heavy as I walked toward the door, every step dragging me further into something I wasn't ready for. But I opened it anyway. Ben stood there, dressed in his usual pressed button-down, his tie loosened like he had just come from work. But his face was different, tense, unreadable. Not the kind of anger that comes in an explosion, but the kind that simmers, waiting for the right moment to boil over.
We need to talk, he said.
His voice was even.
Too even.
I didn't answer right away. I could feel Nate behind me, the weight of his presence like a shadow stretching between us. Ben's eyes flicked past me. He saw him. And just like that, his expression changed. His jaw tightened. His nostrils flared. So it's true, he muttered. I gripped the doorframe. What's true? His gaze snapped back to mine, sharp enough to cut through every single lie I had ever told myself. That he's back. That you. He exhaled harshly, running a hand through his hair. God, Olivia, have you lost your mind? Anger flared in my chest, hot and immediate. You don't get to come here and act like you have any say in my life anymore. You think this is about me? He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. It's about Sam. The air in my lungs disappeared. What? Ben stepped forward. He knows, Olivia. He knows Nate's back. And do you have any idea what that's doing to him? I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Because no, I didn't know. I had spent the last year telling myself I had lost Sam for good, that I had burned that bridge so badly there was no way to rebuild it. I had never let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, he still cared. But if he was talking to Ben, if he knew Nate was back, it meant he had never really stopped watching. He wants to see you, Ben said finally. But he won't do it if, his eyes flicked back to Nate. If he's here. Silence. Heavy. Crushing. I felt Nate tense behind me. I felt the choice settle in my bones. Ben didn't say another word.
He didn't have to.
He just gave me one last long look before turning on his heel and walking back to his car. And then it was just me and Nate. I turned slowly. He was watching me carefully, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. You should go, I whispered. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Olivia. You should go, I repeated, firmer this time. Before I changed my mind. His eyes searched mine, looking for something. Maybe a reason to stay. Maybe an excuse to fight. But I had nothing left to give him. And eventually he nodded. Take care of yourself, Liv, he murmured. Then he turned, walked out the door, and disappeared into the morning light. I met Sam at a diner later that evening. It felt strange, sitting across from him after all this time, watching the way he stirred his coffee absently, avoiding my eyes. He looked older, harder, like life had chipped away at him, the same way it had chipped away at me. Ben said you wanted to talk, I said quietly. He exhaled, finally looking at me. Yeah. I waited, my hands wrapped tightly around my mug. He hesitated, like he wasn't sure where to start. But then he sighed. You look different. I let out a soft laugh.
Yeah, well.
Life does that. He nodded, studying me. I hated you for a long time, he admitted. For what you did. For how he stopped, shaking his head. I didn't understand it. How you could do something like that. How you could ruin everything. My stomach twisted. But then, he continued, quieter this time, I started thinking.
About you.
About Dad. About all the things I never saw before. I swallowed hard. He let out a slow breath. I'm not saying I forgive you, he murmured. But I don't want to hate you anymore. Something in me cracked. I nodded, blinking back the sting in my eyes. I don't want that either. A beat of silence. Then finally, he gave me the smallest, most hesitant smile. And for the first time in a long, long time, I let myself hope. The days that followed felt lighter, like I had finally taken a breath after holding it in for far too long. Sam and I weren't fixed, not even close, but we were talking. Small things at first. The weather. Work. His friends. But it was a start. A fragile, delicate thread that I was too afraid to pull too hard on. But even as I focused on repairing what I had broken, there was something else lingering beneath the surface. Or rather, someone.
Nate.
I didn't reach out. I told myself I wouldn't. That I had made the right decision in asking him to leave. But that didn't stop my mind from drifting back to him when the nights stretched long and quiet. It didn't stop me from wondering where he was, what he was thinking, if he was still in town at all. Then one evening, I got my answer. I was coming out of the grocery store when I saw him. He was across the parking lot, leaning against his car, arms crossed, watching me like he had been waiting. My breath caught. I told myself to keep walking, to get in my car and drive away. But I didn't. Instead, I turned. And just like that, I was standing in front of him, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're still here," I said quietly. He smirked. "You sound surprised." "I am." He studied me for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. I wasn't going to leave without saying goodbye this time. Something in my chest twisted. I thought we already said goodbye. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Maybe. But it didn't feel like it. I swallowed hard, shifting on my feet. "What do you want, Nate?" His eyes held mine. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just needed to see you." A lump formed in my throat. Because I had needed to see him too. I just didn't know if I could survive losing him a second time. I told myself it was just one drink. That meeting Nate at a quiet bar on the outskirts of town wasn't the worst decision I could make. We sat in a booth in the corner, the air thick with unspoken words, the kind of tension that didn't need to be acknowledged to be felt. "You look good," he said after a while, watching me over the rim of his glass. I scoffed, shaking my head. "You're a terrible liar."
He smirked.
"I never lied to you, Liv." My stomach twisted at the way he said my name, like it still belonged to him, like I still belonged to him. "I don't know what you want me to say, Nate," I sighed. "I made my choice." He leaned back, tilting his head slightly. "Did you?" I looked away. It was the right thing to do.
His voice was softer this time.
"And did it make you happy?" I didn't answer, because we both already knew. The night stretched on, conversation ebbing and flowing like the tide. It was easy, like slipping back into something familiar, something I had spent too long pretending I didn't miss. At some point, I stopped thinking about what was right and wrong, and started thinking about what I wanted. By the time we left the bar, it was late. Too late. The air was cool, the streets quiet. We stood beside my car, the weight of the evening pressing down on us. "This is dangerous," I murmured. Nate smirked. "Since when have you been afraid of a little danger?" I let out a breathless laugh, shaking my head. Then, before I could second-guess myself, I stepped closer. "And Nate?"
He met me halfway.
I don't know how long we stood there, caught in something we both knew we shouldn't want but couldn't let go of. Eventually, he reached up, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "What now?" he whispered. I swallowed hard. "I don't know. But I wanted to. God, I wanted to. Because for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't want to walk away." The drive home was silent. Not the heavy, unbearable silence I had come to know over the past year, but a different kind. A charged kind. The kind that fills the air with something unspoken, something waiting to be acknowledged. Nate was following behind me in his car. He didn't have to. I hadn't asked him to. But as I pulled into my driveway and watched his headlights slow, I realized something. Neither of us wanted the night to end. I sat in my car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, thinking, debating. Then I opened my door. And so did he. We stood in the driveway, the world around us quiet and still. My house was dark, empty. A reminder of everything I had lost. Everything I had let go of. Come inside, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Nate didn't hesitate. The second the door closed behind us, I felt it. The shift. The inevitability of whatever was about to happen. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. This is a mistake, I murmured. Nate stepped closer. Maybe. I swallowed hard. Then why does it feel like the only thing that makes sense? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because when he reached for me, when his fingers brushed against mine, I didn't pull away. I let it happen. I let him in. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. Morning came too soon. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft shadows across the walls. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, reality slowly creeping back in. I had done it again. I had let him back in. And I had no idea what that meant. I turned my head slightly, my breath catching as I saw Nate sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to me. His shoulders were tense, his hands clasped together like he was deep in thought, like he was regretting it. The realization sent a sharp ache through my chest. You're leaving, I murmured. He turned slightly, his eyes meeting mine. I don't want to. Then don't. His expression softened.
Leave.
I sat up, wrapping the sheets around me. You always leave, Nate. You walk away before things get complicated, before you have to deal with the consequences. But guess what? I gestured between us, my voice shaking. This is already complicated. It was complicated a year ago. It's complicated now. And I'm done pretending otherwise. His jaw tightened. You think I want to leave? That I wanted to leave before? Then why did you? He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Because I thought it was the right thing to do. Because I thought I had already ruined your life enough. I laughed bitterly. Newsflash, Nate. You weren't the only one who made mistakes. Silence stretched between us. Then finally he sighed. What do you want from me, Liv? I met his gaze, my heart pounding. I want you to stay. The words hung between us, heavy and fragile. And this time, he didn't walk away. We tried to be careful, tried to take things slow. But it was impossible to pretend we weren't who we were. That whatever this was, whatever had been pulling us together all this time, wasn't real. But the world doesn't forget so easily. And neither does the past. I was reminded of that 2 weeks later, when I walked into my favorite coffee shop and came face to face with my son. And he wasn't alone. Ben was with him. And the second they saw me, I knew. They knew. And just like that, the fragile life I had been rebuilding came crumbling down all over again. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Sam looked at me first. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, scanned my face like he was searching for something. An explanation, maybe. An excuse. But I had none to give. Then there was Ben. His expression was different, calmer. Like he had already made peace with something I hadn't. I swallowed hard, gripping the strap of my purse. He stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. Don't. My chest tightened. Just let me. Let you what? His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. A dangerous, bitter edge. Lie to me again? Pretend like you didn't pick him over me all over again? That's not. Yes, it is, he cut me off. His jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. You didn't even try, Mom. You didn't fight for us. You just let everything fall apart because it was easier than facing what you did. The words hit harder than I expected, because deep down I knew he was right. I had spent the last year convincing myself that I was rebuilding my life, that I had been making things right. But I had never actually fixed anything. I had just found a new way to escape. Ben exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Sam, let's go. But Sam didn't move. He was still staring at me, his expression wavering. Like there was something else he wanted to say, but didn't know how. Finally, he shook his head. I don't know if I can do this again. Sam, please. But he was already turning away, already walking toward the door. And then he was gone.
Ben lingered.
He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze softer than it should have been. Then he sighed. You're not a bad person, Olivia. You just don't know what you want. The words were gentle, but they cut deeper than any anger ever could. Because, once again, he was right. I had spent so long chasing something, freedom, love, excitement, I didn't even know anymore, that I had never stopped to ask myself if I was actually happy. And now, I was standing in the wreckage of my choices. Alone. Again. I didn't call Nate that night. Or the night after. For the first time since this entire mess started, I sat in the silence and let it consume me. I let myself feel the weight of everything I had lost. And I finally asked myself the one question I had been avoiding all along. What did I actually want? The answer came slower than I expected. I wanted peace. Not the kind that comes from running, or distraction, or reckless decisions made in the dark. But real peace. The kind that comes from knowing who you are, from making choices you can live with. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I couldn't have that with Nate. He had been my escape, my rebellion, my mistake. But he wasn't my future. And if I wanted any chance at fixing what I had broken, I had to let him go. For good this time. I saw him one last time. I met him at the place where everything had started, my house. He was waiting on the porch when I pulled up, like he already knew this was coming. I took a deep breath, walking up the steps, stopping just short of him. His eyes searched mine. So this is it? I nodded. Yeah. He exhaled slowly, shoving his hands in his pockets. I can't say I didn't see it coming. I gave him a sad smile. Me neither. We stood there for a long moment, caught in the quiet weight of everything we had been, and everything we would never be. Then, finally, he reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. A small, lingering touch. One last goodbye. Take care of yourself, Liv, he murmured. You too. And with that, I walked inside. I didn't look back. Because for the first time in a long, long time, I was finally ready to move forward.